in Gaza is 3 times worse than it was during the last war 5 years ago. And Europe hovers on the brink of full-scale conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Now, the United Nations was born from the ashes of World War II. And after decades of wars, both hot and cold, can it today bring order to a world of collapsing borders and viral anarchy? That's the question I posed to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who joined me from UN headquarters in New York. Secretary General, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It seems, Mr. Secretary General, that everywhere we look, there are horrendous messes. In Iraq and Syria, for instance, now we hear that ISIS has captured a strategic military base. We're told from London that it now controls territory the size of Great Britain, with 4 million people in that territory. Can this stand unchecked, or does it have to be rolled back?
Now, the world is confronting multiple crises at this time, starting from the situation in Iraq, and we have a very serious crisis in Ukraine, but we still have a crisis in Libya, South Sudan, Central African Republic. On top of this, we are now being hit by Ebola epidemics. All these require concerted efforts of international community. United Nations is really trying to mobilize all resources, all political will. Now, coming back to this current situations which is happening in Iraq, and particularly in northern Iraq, Erbil area, it's a totally unacceptable and horrendous situations caused by Islamic State, ISIL. This international community must really be united, take all necessary actions. At this time, we have millions of displaced people in that area.
I hear your plea that you're making. You're obviously very stretched for resources, and you've described a huge number of challenges. But clearly, the humanitarian situation will continue to get worse, particularly in Iraq and Syria, if ISIS is not pushed back. What do you think the world needs to do to confront ISIS and to roll back the territory that it has gained?
The United Nations cannot do it alone in addressing international terrorism and extremists. The way they have been terrorizing the international community and people by kidnapping the women, children, and particularly journalists, this is totally unacceptable. These are against international humanitarian law and against international human rights law. And we saw this horrendous the killing of Mr. James Foley that we have condemned in the strongest possible terms. At the same time, United Nations played a certain role in getting Mr. Curtis, Peter Theo Curtis, to be released through UN UNDOF yesterday in Golan Heights. And I really appreciate the countries who have been really helping to facilitate. And I understand that President Obama is going to convene a certain summit-level meeting next month on the margins of General Assembly at the United Nations to deal with this matter. We need, first of all, political will, combined solidarity and political will, and provide all necessary resources possible.
You know, you talk about political will, and this has been obviously in great shortage for many, many years, particularly with the crisis in Syria. You remember 2 years ago, I asked you, in the midst of some failed UN-sponsored political negotiations, what is Plan B for Syria? And you told me very honestly, there is no Plan B. Would you agree that the rise of ISIS and the horrors that you're just describing are a result of there being no Plan B?
This continuing Syrian crisis has caused all other extremist and terrorist groups to keep their roots established. That is quite worrisome. That is why I have always been urging that number one priority should be that the parties must stop violence unconditionally and return to political dialogue table. As you know, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, has announced last week that number of people killed since the beginning of this Syrian crisis has reached close to 200,000.
Right.
These are all confirmed deaths, but if we include unconfirmed deaths, the number will be much, much higher.
Well, let me ask you, because you mentioned Navi Pillay, and she actually also said at the Security Council that it was the political paralysis that has emboldened what she called these killers. Listen to what she said about the world community's failure in this regard.
Short-term geopolitical considerations and national interests, narrowly defined, have repeatedly taken precedence over intolerable human suffering and grave breaches of and long-term threats to international peace and security. I firmly believe that greater responsiveness by this Council would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
Do you agree, Mr. Secretary General, with her harsh assessment?
I fully agree with what Navi Pillay just said at the Security Council. I also did say almost the same things. We have seen some very encouraging, successful example when United Nations Security Council is united. They can deliver very quickly, very efficiently, anything, like as we have seen the destruction of Syrian chemical weapons. We have destroyed all registered chemical weapons in Syria. Now we are in the process of trying to destroy the chemical weapon producing facilities. Therefore, the political will and agreement and consensus view of Security Council, particularly between the United States and Russia, is crucially important. I again urge the Security Council's strong political will on the basis of solidarity and humanity.
Let me turn to Israel and Gaza. That continues to be a very active and very hot war even today. And, you know, you have used some very, very strong language to condemn particularly strikes against UN schools in the Gaza Strip that have killed several people. You have called it a moral outrage and a criminal act. How do you plan to hold Israel accountable and Hamas accountable for its actions?
The catastrophic tragedy which happened in Gaza is, again, totally unacceptable. I think these are all a violation of international humanitarian laws, and I have condemned in the strongest possible terms the killing of civilians and people, and children and women, and destruction of infrastructures. We have to address the root causes. There are many issues which have already been identified by the parties. What are the problems? I have been urging that all these issues must be resolved through a political negotiation. I'm deeply concerned and disappointed that this even fragile ceasefire has not been kept. It has been broken again. All these key actors must unite on the political will. They go back to Cairo and agree on a more durable, sustainable ceasefire.
Okay.
On the basis of that, we have to reconstruct Gaza, and we have to investigate all these violations of international human rights and humanitarian laws, including the attack on UN staff and UN facilities.
Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, thank you very much for joining me tonight.